tell me about BHQ versus BHS, because I came through seminary 20 years ago. That's all we had. That's what we used.
Right.
BHQ is not fully available yet, I believe.
Yeah. So I was invited to the annual meeting of the BHQ participants. I think it was like 2018.
And for
Something like
viewers,
that.
just so you know,
Yeah.
BHQ is the successor to
Right.
BHS. It's going to
Yeah.
be
Biblica Hebraica Quinta.
yeah, it's going to Quinta, the fifth edition. It's going to take the place of BHS, just like BHS took the place of earlier edition of the Biblica Hebraica. So Chris is part of the group that's working on it, and it's not like writing a book. It's a decades long endeavor. And so,
Right.
what was your role in it, or what is your role?
Yeah, so I was only involved with a short time just because of transitions, in my own career. But it's because of my work with the Subloco notes, I was dealing with problems in the Masorah, and so those side notes in the manuscripts. And so one of the initiatives of BHQ is to present all of the information that's on every page of the manuscript. BHS in the previous editions did not do that. They presented the text, the small Masorah notes with some editorial changes. But what BHQ decided to do was to present the text, the biblical text, as it appears in one specific manuscript, the Leningrad Codex, in addition to presenting also the entire Masorah, even when the text or the Masorah is in error, even where there's a corruption. So basically, BHQ is a reproduction of a manuscript from the early 11th century. And then down below is an apparatus, just like BHS has, but made simpler, easier to read. A lot of those Latin terms were taken out.
Good.
But in addition to that, they have added a commentary by the editors to explain some of the more problematic issues. So in cases where we're not really sure if the text of the Leningrad Codex is right, maybe the spelling is corrupted or the division between two words is incorrect. So they'll put a comment in there to help the reader understand how they think the problematic issue should be resolved. And so I had helped for a little bit with some of the issues with the Masorah. And so very small role, but unfortunately, it was one of those things I just could not continue with because it doesn't pay. And I was at a time where I was in a job transition and the whole thing.
Right.
But the project is just going on and on and on.
Is there even a finish line remotely?
I don't think so right now. I mean, they're getting much closer, and I know that there is a schedule for the publication of various volumes, but there have been so many setbacks along the way, because a lot of the scholars who have worked on this project have been veteran scholars, and sadly, many of them have died during, their work, and so, they're not able to complete their tasks. Someone else has to pick it up.
Again, most casual Bible readers don't even have an inkling of an understanding of what is involved in getting an English Bible to them. And so, when you're talking, it's like the image I think of as a cathedral. Medieval cathedrals, you laid the stone knowing you will never see this. You will never see this completed. Those who lay the first stones, this is going to take a century or longer to build. And it's like that with massive scholarly things like BHQ. You're talking about doing work you will spend months of your life analyzing a word or a phrase in a manuscript. And did you ever see the documentary Jiro Dreams of Sushi?
No, I haven't seen that.
Okay. So it's a fascinating documentary. I think it used to be on Netflix. It might be on YouTube now, but it's about a guy. Right. His name is Jiro. And he was 80s, 90s, maybe, sushi master, Michelin star. His restaurant was 8 seats. I believe it was 8 seats at a sushi counter in a basement with no advertising, no nothing. I think it was a 6-month waiting list to get there. The meal was $300 and you didn't get to pick the menu. He would make like something like 12 pieces of sushi or 14, something like that. Anyway, so the documentary is all about this guy's passion for sushi and him having like a 40 or 60-year-old apprentice who has to work for years before you can even touch the rice. Like you've got to do, I mean, it's one of those things that, and I think as a scholar, it's just a great documentary in general. It's very engaging. But the thing that blows people away about it, why it was so acclaimed, was because it showed this focus on craftsmanship and excellence that was seemingly over something as mundane as a little piece of nigiri. Mm-hmm. But the way he talked about it and the effort and what went into it and the practice so when I hearing discussions of and going to SBL and seeing biblical scholarship and what all goes on behind the scenes, it brings to mind that kind of thing. You have to have a passion for biblical scholarship to a degree that seems insane to other people.
That's about right. Yep.
It really does. At the same time, though, at least for a Christian scholar, there's something incredibly comforting about that because it's a passion guided by bringing the Word of God to people.
Right.
And so there literally is eternal stakes involved in what you're doing, even if what you're doing is trying to tell, is this a dot or a dash? Is this a smudge from the vellum or the manuscript ink, or is this what the person wrote?
Right.
There's a reason that so much work goes into it. And we, on the popular end, are the recipients of that. We're the recipients of, so when you were laboring away in what seems to be laboring in obscurity or laboring in vain to a lot of scholars, especially young scholars starting out, I want them to be encouraged and to know that there is a payoff, even if it's never seen, even if you may never live to see the fruits of what you do, but if it's being guided by God and if you're fulfilling your calling as a scholar, then that's when you just have to trust some water, some harvest, and I'm going to water in the trenches or in the library stacks.
Yep. Yeah, but it was part of that though, where, that caused me to write Jesus's Bible, because there was that element of dissatisfaction that, I'm a people person. And even though I have spent most of my time in, an academic environment, it is important for me to get stuff out there. And that's why I wrote that. And even though some people would say, it's still kind of academic, I look at that book this way: it was my best effort to distill some of these complexities and to provide brief explanations that people could get their minds around anyway, and point them to other sources if they wanted further, more detailed, more comprehensive discussion.
Yeah, and it's needed. I mean, it really is needed, and I think Disciple Dojo's growing viewership is evidence, at least of a small part of it, that there's a hunger among people to know stuff. I tell people that, think about Joe Rogan, his podcast, right? Joe Rogan's this jujitsu dude, bro, fear factor, actor, comedian. I mean, he's an entertainer, but his podcast, the number one podcast in the world, or at least always in the top 3 podcasts in the world, will be him sitting down with some analytical physicist or some AI intelligence guy or some nutritionist just random person. I know two of my friends have been on his podcast, both for martial arts related stuff, and they'll talk for 4 hours and people will listen. Millions of people, dude bros, working at gas stations, doing jujitsu, housewife, all of that. There's an audience for anything that is intellectually interesting.
Right.
And to me, biblical scholarship is one of those things. It gets presented by, especially by preachers or maybe popularizers sometimes, as dry or as boring. You know, the whole how many angels dancing on the head of a pin. That's what theologians sit around and argue about, and which is in and of itself not true. That's actually an urban legend. But the whole idea of it not being interesting has never made sense to me. If I pick up a Bible, the first part I'll always pick up and read the preface to that Bible, because it's going to have all of this, you know, interesting, fascinating, kind of nerdy stuff that's then going to tell you, oh, that's why this translation translates this way. That's why the books are in this order. And part of reviewing study Bibles here on the channel, I mean, we've reviewed over 50 study Bibles, and it's because of that. I want people to get into these resources and see these resources. I think your book does a great job of it. Your book, I found myself really enjoying it. There were some, I'd have to go back and look. I don't remember off the top of my head. There were a few points where I was like, I don't know, Chris, I don't know if I agree with that, but you know, you're explaining it really well, and it's making a lot of sense. And I think that's the value of it. You know, I think you interact with some of the other scholars who I've read and appreciated, and sometimes you're, you know, sometimes you criticize them for something, but then sometimes you'll say, and as so-and-so has said, like it's a discussion. It's an interaction. It's we just need more of it. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. So in New Testament studies, there are trends. There are things that come and go. There, you know, like the quest for the historical Jesus, and then the next quest for the historical Jesus, and then the third quest for, you know, these kind of waves, past probably 15. And these are like decade waves, not year by year, but the past, since I was in seminary, you know, the new perspective on Paul, and that's still kind of, I feel like it's kind of surpassed its heyday in terms of being talked about. But there are these scholarship trends. And so I'm wondering if you are aware of any, or if there are any, that are Old Testament focused. You know, like I would think of in the maybe late 1800s through the early 20th century, the various documentary hypotheses and redaction theory, source theory, these were kind of the thing that Old Testament scholars were putting a lot of energy into, which they don't seem to really do that much anymore. I mean, those kind of seem to have had their heyday in terms of dominating the conversation.
Yeah,
and so
I don't think anything really dominates the conversation anymore, for the simple reason that scholars, I mean, you look at the attendance at SBL, for instance, the number of presenters, the number of sessions, and the growth of the field, and in many ways problematic in that, you know, institutions of higher education are taking more doctoral students in the PhD programs than there are jobs for.
Mm-hmm.
And that's even at the major institutions, you know, they're over enrolling. And then you have some of these smaller schools where truthfully the graduates will not have much of a shot at a job at all, but they're doing research and they're producing research. And so there really is just this saturation where you have so many people doing so many different things and you can't keep up with it all. So it's really a very different landscape than it was, say, 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Or, you know, when you look at the history of the scholarship of the Hebrew Bible, you know, Wellhausen to Gunkel and so on, and others, the field was a lot smaller.
Right.
The amount of available evidence was a heck of a lot smaller. To be able to really know the whole field, it was more of a reality then. It's simply impossible now. One of the interesting trends, though, that I saw at Jewish Theological Seminary is this shift towards the interpretation history of the Bible as opposed to the prehistory of the Bible. Just a ton of interest in the broader field of the interpretation of the Bible. You see a lot of Jewish scholarship, you know, dealing with the New Testament, for instance, and a lot of cross-pollination. So I would say a heavy shift to the interpretation of the Bible has been a big one. And that's even affected textual criticism, because, many text critics, instead of looking for trying to get back to the original text, they get into the unique features of specific manuscripts and, the interpretive features that are there in the copies. So that even has a bearing on textual criticism over the last, from my perspective, 20 years. Maybe it's longer than that, but
I wanted to ask, what was that like? As how were you treated? How was your studies viewed?
It was a very different environment from an evangelical Christian seminary, but it was the best thing for me, because being a fish out of water just helped me to see so many things differently. Things that I never gave a second thought to. It got me questioning those things. And it didn't really have any bearing on my faith. It gave me a deeper appreciation for the lengthy and robust Jewish tradition of looking at the Bible. And, from a faith perspective, we don't see eye to eye on these things, but, I've learned an immense amount of just information about the Hebrew Bible's complex history, not only of transmission, but of interpretation. And so, being a fish out of water was the best thing for me.
I was going to say, I imagine that it would have to have a refining aspect to it, where it helps you clarify and see blind spots. Right. And question. I mean, that's part of that. That's a bigger cultural discussion that we're having in this country with things about white supremacy and, being a minority in a culture and intersectionality and all of those things. You don't recognize your own culture if it is the dominant one or if it is the norm in your setting. But when you go out of that, then you're given a better lens to look at your culture. And that my whole life has been among evangelical Christianity in the traditional, like I tell people, the Christianity today as an outlet type Christianity, broad evangelicalism. Right. And there's a tendency I see when it comes to evangelicals and our Jewish friends that's either kind of like a leaning into the supersessionism of full-on replacement theology and almost looking down upon Judaism, not Jewish people, but Judaism, kind of as okay, well, that's, there's nothing really to learn from that. It's nice. It's sentimental. We'll wish you happy Hanukkah, but there's nothing of real value there. So I'm just going to, you go do your thing. we'll do ours. To the other extreme among evangelicals, where Israel and Judaism almost takes on this, I've said, I don't know if it's quite, almost like a fetish quality among Christians, where it's like everything Jewish is automatically better and automatically more holy. So we're going to, the whole sacred names movement and Hebrew roots movement. And if you celebrate Christmas, you're not really a good Christian because you're not following Messiah, Yeshua. And I feel like both of those are kind of come from not having a familiarity with good, thoughtful Jewish scholarship and thoughtful Judaism.
I'm inclined to agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I think they're hyper reactionary. I mean, one example, and I happened to look at one of your posts on Facebook, and there was a viewer who asked a question about Jephthah's vow. And I was glad that I saw that, because David Marcus, who, my dissertation advisor before he was into Masorah, he did a lot with text studies, and he has a very short book, I think it's like 60 pages or something, on Jephthah's vow. But it opened up that passage to me, and we don't have the time to get into it, but it was valuable because he looked at the text, he looked at some of the ambiguities in the text, but then he also looked at some of the Parshanim, the medieval Jewish rabbis, and some of the great observations that they had. And, it's from stuff like that, learning about the interpretive advances in biblical interpretation in the Middle Ages, that I learned at Jewish Theological Seminary that really helped me. And Jephthah's vow is just a wonderful example. So, for the viewer who asked that question, I'm not giving you an answer today. Go read David Marcus's book. I think it's available for free online these days in PDF form. So David Marcus, I think the title is just Jephthah's vow.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, I remember teaching through Judges here in our video series and coming to that one, and you've got to, it's one of those where I'm like, I'm not going to give you a strong yes, like you're going to have to wrestle with this yourself. I think that's intentional. But the more I study, the more I start to think almost all the ambiguities are intentional. Not all, but let's say most. I sort of lean towards
rhetorical device.
Yeah. Because part of these interviews are wanting to get people more involved in the discussion and more literate. So give me 2 or 3 either must-read resources or names of individuals whose work have benefited you the most, or you think are the most important for any budding student of Old Testament biblical studies, maybe text criticism, but just people who want to get more into the Hebrew Bible. Who are some that you would put on that list, or who would you point people to? Obviously, your book. Obviously, Jesus's Bible.
Yeah,
that's
no,
obviously.
I put myself down the list. Yeah, right.
So start.
Very kind of you. Yeah. I guess in all seriousness, what I did do with that book is, for its brevity, I think it's 120 pages or something like that. The bibliography is robust, and that was done intentionally because I wanted people to see the breadth of resources that I use in coming to my conclusions.
Right.
So I have no problem with people disagreeing with me, but at least when they read what I write, if they have a problem with it, they can see that I didn't come to these decisions rashly. And the books that I put in that bibliography, yes, some of them are hyper technical, but many of them are, relatively accessible and are all, in my opinion, important reads for various reasons. I would say the most important book that I read during the course of my studies and career has been Alexander Rofe, R-O-F-E, An Introduction to the Hebrew Bible as Literature. It's not your standard OT intro book. There are lots of good ones out there, but this actually teaches one how to actually read the Bible. So of all the books I have, if I could only keep one, that would be it. In all truthfulness, my doctoral advisor, David Marcus, is, I think, to study his works will give someone a good sense of the breadth of the field of Hebrew Bible, including textual criticism. But in addition, it will help one to see what it means to be a serious scholar.
That's more than enough for anybody who's out there wanting to head down this road, or at least peek down the tunnel and see how far the well goes. If you could share briefly, maybe 1 or 2 Old Testament, we looked at Mark 1:1, but Old Testament examples where text criticism makes a difference. 1 or 2, it doesn't matter, just something that really solidifies or crystallizes in the mind of somebody for whom this is still all an abstract discussion, what difference text criticism makes.
The example that always comes to mind, truthfully, is Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 10. And
I'm going to pull that up on the screen here so folks can see. On the left, just for people viewing, because Chris can't see my screen, there is the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text on the left. Then next to that, I've got the NIV 2011, then the NRSV UE, Updated New Revised Standard, and then the ESV. So we have a range of translations as well as the Hebrew text. So why is this an interesting? Why pick this one out?
Yeah, so the sons of Israel is one reading. It's the traditional reading that we find in the Masoretic text, and Yet the English translations show, because they all differ, some say sons of Israel, but others say instead gods or sons of the gods, which is a term for angels. All of these readings are attested in the first century, and it's unclear how they developed. And if you read the commentary in Biblica Hebraica Quinta, a few views are given on how these readings developed. But it seems to me, and in keeping with a quote unquote rule of textual criticism, which is more of a guideline, is that the most difficult reading, or the more difficult reading, when we're presented with two or more options, that's the one that's to be preferred. And so when we look at this and we say there are different options, and sorry for the background here, my dog is going crazy in the background. But
we love dogs here in the dojo.
Yes, yeah. So, but when we ask ourselves, which is the easier reading and which is the more difficult one? The easier reading is clearly the sons of Israel, right? So that, the Most High is the same as Yahweh in verse 9, or the Lord, as most translations put it. Mm-hmm. The more difficult reading, theologically anyway, is if we read the sons of gods, or just the gods themselves at the end of verse 8, instead of the sons of Israel, because that seems to presuppose that there are other divine beings. That doesn't sound monotheistic at all. Right. And so when we ask ourselves, which is likely to be the older reading, it's the guidelines of, or the wisdom of the field of textual criticism says, well, generally it's the more difficult reading. And if that's the case, then it means that this more polytheistic, or we would really say henotheistic, but a more polytheistic sounding perspective was actually original to Deuteronomy. Now, there are scholars who see it differently. There are some scholars who argue that these variant readings didn't occur until almost the time of Jesus anyway. The problem I have with that, just on a strictly academic perspective, or from an academic perspective, is what would cause someone to introduce these readings into the texts. And so my assumption, and I admit it is an assumption, is that originally Deuteronomy, kind of like what you find in the Ten Commandments, you shall have no other gods before me, right? And even I think Psalm 88 seems to allude to the fact that there are other gods out there. That's probably the original reading. Now, we're not talking here about metaphysics. We're not settling a theological dispute about whether a monotheistic view or a polytheistic view is the right one. I'm a monotheist by faith, but just in terms of the text itself, it seems that the text would support a more polytheistic perspective. And to me, as a historian, that makes sense, because when you think about, the history of ancient Israel, maybe they shouldn't have been, but the Old Testament text says that for all intents and purposes, almost all of them were polytheists.
Well, that's the biggest critique of the prophets against Israel, was their syncretism.
Yeah,
sure.
So, and that raises a question. Well, if a monotheistic worldview is the right one, why would God have ever allowed, such a reading to be there in the first place? And so people may object to this perspective on theological grounds. Well, at that point, I can't argue it anymore, but from a historical perspective, I would, as objective as I can be, I would have to conclude that the more difficult reading is indeed the more original reading. But I may be wrong.
Yeah, that's a good example. And people have asked me about this. I think Carmen Imes and I talked about this in the episode with her, because so many people have asked her, what's up with the sons of God and the divine count, and her friend Mike Heiser has made quite a splash in the world of biblical studies, or at least popular readers of biblical studies, with his work on the unseen realm and angels and demons. So this is a great example of a passage that's significant, but it's also, I like how you're talking about, it's a text critical issue that people need to be aware of. The ESV footnote says, compare the Dead Sea Scroll and the Septuagint, because the Masoretic text says sons of Israel. So it comes down to, for viewers who this is all completely brand new, you have a Hebrew text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you have a Greek translation of the Hebrew text, the Septuagint, and they both date to the time of Jesus, roughly. They say sons of God, or the gods, sons of the Most High, or however you, not Most High, sons of the gods, or the gods. So they say one thing, the Hebrew text is not actually older, because the Hebrew text is the Masoretic text, which is a medieval manuscript, and that says the sons of Israel. So it's an example of how you can't always assume that just because the Hebrew text says this, that's the oldest reading, because the Dead Sea Scrolls show that no, there's a Hebrew text, Dead Sea Scrolls, and it says the other one. So that's a great, I really hope that viewers, even if you can't, if you're watching this and you can't wrap your head around all the details, it doesn't matter. That's what commentaries and journal articles are for, to really dig into this. But just to give you an idea of why text critical work matters and what difference it makes. Now, is this a salvific issue? Does how God divided the nations or allotted the nations and the metaphysical identity of angels and all of that, is that a salvation issue? I don't think so.
Right.
Is it a fascinating theological issue? Of course it is.
Nope.
It's worth thinking about. The example that I use, which we've done here on the channel, is Goliath's height, and whether it's 6 cubits in a span or 4 cubits in a span. And that's another example of where the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint both say 4 cubits in a span. The Masoretic text says 6 cubits in a span. And so... Or
when Saul became king.
Yeah,
he was
1-year-old.
So, yeah.
Those are great. Well, hopefully viewers are just getting an idea of why this matters and text criticism, why it's interesting, because in Chris's book, he goes into more detail. He gives a number of examples and has illustrations and pictures, and actually you can see the text on the page and parts of it. And so go read his book. Go read his book. That's all I'm going to say. Let's finish up with, we're all about shameless plugs here in the dojo. So I get asked all the time about these viral videos that Christians love to share that talk all about Hebrew. Everything from every time you breathe, you're saying the name Yahweh, to the whole gospel is contained in the letters of Bereshith in Genesis. And it really means God will live in the tent of man and something, something, something. And they're usually TikTok videos. They're usually YouTube videos. They're quick, they're pithy, they're memorable, and they're just not true. At least everything I know about biblical scholarship, they're not true. The idea of the folded napkin, and that being the tradition that the host is going to come back to the table. And so Jesus leaving the folded shroud at the tomb was, every Jewish person would know it's him saying he's coming back. These stories circulate, and Christians share them because we want to believe them. Because anything in the Hebrew is automatically more esoteric and cool and authentic and this and that. But most of the time, they're just nonsense. And so how do you encourage people to not get sucked in by, other than, hey, verify something before you share it on social media? But we can't always do that immediately. So just a general rule of thumb, how do we know when something is probably not accurate that's being presented to Christians?
Yeah. If it's being shared on TikTok, I would say assume that it's not true.
Good rule.
So, because generally TikTok is not the vehicle for disseminating truth in biblical studies. I'm going to be very measured in my
very diplomatic, but I agree. Yes.
But what I would say in terms of some practical advice is, for those who are genuinely interested in finding out more about these significant cultural issues, there's a 2-volume set by InterVarsity Press. I always get these titles confused. They all run together. But the Bible background commentary of the New Testament, I think it is, and the Bible background commentary of the Old Testament. Put together
IVP, Bible background commentary.
There it is. Thank you. These titles all just get jumped. They're fantastic works. And now, just because something doesn't appear in there doesn't mean it's not true. But I think by using those really concise and very affordable tools, it will help one to develop a sense of whether something makes sense or is worth investigation when you hear it online. And furthermore, it's a reliable way to find out about the cool types of things that you're already interested in. So I would say, forget about TikTok, switch over to the IVP Bible Background Commentary series, and you'll be very glad you did. It's more profitable.
Yeah, that's great advice. I heartily agree. I definitely recommend those. The New Testament one is by Craig Keener as the editor, and John Walton edited the Old Testament volume. Is this a fair thing to say? I think my own understanding is that much of what gets read into the Jewish background of Jesus type presentations, not all, but much of it actually comes from, I think, either the Mishnah or something later than the first century. I may be misquoting that, but so a lot of these practices of like, oh, every Hebrew boy would know X, Y, Z. When you look at the source, it's a second or third century or later Jewish source rather than first century Galilee. Am I in the right ballpark?
That's a tricky one to answer, because like the work that I've done with the Targums, the Aramaic Bible, what we essentially call the Aramaic Targumim today all appear to be written, at least in their current forms. They're redacted into their current forms after the time of Jesus. But there is little doubt that some of the traditions that are in there surely date back to the time of Jesus.
Right.
And so the question about, can you use a later source to determine something that was going on in the time of Jesus is not an easy one. And you have to really be ready to roll up your sleeves and do a lot of investigative work on a case-by-case basis. And at the end of the day, a lot of times there is not going to be proof. What you're going to get is, pieces of evidence of various shades of reliability. And that's because in scholarship, we don't deal with proof anyway. We deal with evidence. Convincing evidence, moderately convincing evidence, not so convincing evidence, but we don't deal with proof because there were no video cameras and, that sort of thing. And so there's always going to be room for discussion. I would say really the best source that I'm aware of, in addition to the IVP Bible background commentary, I haven't used the New Testament volume a lot lately. So I know Keener draws a lot from Jewish tradition, so I assume there's a lot of that in there. But the Jewish Study Bible, the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which is done by Jewish scholars, and it's a very competent work. Christians who are not familiar with Jewish, sacred sources like the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Targumim and all that will probably need some guidance to use it most effectively. But it still, to my knowledge, is the best source. And I would say if you're interested in this kind of thing, go and consult those 2 volumes first, and then you'll probably be on solid footing.
To me, I think it's helpful for our viewers because it shows that when you see these teachings that are presented so winsomely and so convincingly, and they state things as if they're absolutely true, that's when I think a healthy skepticism should pop up, especially if it's something that makes so much sense that we want to believe. I think we should be like, that's very interesting. Let me go check on that. because it doesn't mean you reject it. We don't want to be naturally suspicious of everything and just, I'm not going to believe it unless you.
Right.
But, okay, whenever people tell me, especially I have friends that are kind of all over the spectrum, and some in the more charismatic, and some in the more like Hebrew roots cultures. And whenever somebody will share something and it's really exciting, and they're like, "Oh, I've done my research, and this means this and this," and it's something sometimes that I actually know is not true. I don't ever want to be like, "No, you're dumb. That's not." I always want to encourage the enthusiasm, but temper the, just to show the limitations. To say, "Listen,
Right.
It's not like it's impossible, but it's certainly not definitive," and so.
Yeah.
Being able to hold things in loose hands.
Probability and plausibility, but very often not definitiveness,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So then on that note, what about the Bible codes? You said there's no letter certainty, but if you feed the letters of the Hebrew Bible into a supercomputer, you can predict 9/11, you can predict the stock market, you can predict all this stuff, because I watched the documentary on the History Channel, and it's pretty compelling. So.
And I'm sure the dates of my birth and death and all of that are in there too. So, sorry, I shouldn't be snarky, but no,
from the Bible codes, you're allowed to be snarky, I think.
Okay,
go ahead.
All right.
Tell me why. Yeah. Tell me why you would not put much stock in the Bible codes.
Yeah, and so for those who have stuck around this long and have tolerated the arcane discussion about my dissertation work and the subloco notes. One of the things that those subloco notes deal with, in part, has to do with the presence and absence of optional letters in Hebrew words. So the example I give in my book, Jesus' Bible, is, the first town I lived in was Foxborough, Massachusetts. And, if you watch a Patriots game these days, I think when they spell out Foxborough, it's Foxboro. But if you go to the Common, or what is the town green in Foxborough, big sign up around the Common, which spells it with its longer spelling ending in O-U-G-H. They're both legitimate spellings. Many words in Hebrew Bible had optional ways of spelling them, and spelling conventions changed over the course of the centuries too. And that's just observable in manuscripts that we have today. They disagree on how to spell words. So if that's the case, and every letter matters, well, which manuscript are you using? There is no one letter perfect edition of the Bible. And when people talk about Bible code, the first question you ask is, which text of the Bible are you using?
Yeah, for those who just don't know anything about Bible codes, it's not even getting into it, but somebody feeds a massive amount of data into a computer, a text, and then based on where the letters are in relation to each other in a grid, when you lay them out, you can see it's like a big word search, and you can find words that supposedly have meaning, and it doesn't work if the text is one letter off. If you move it one letter one way or the other, the whole thing breaks down. So The Bible codes it's modern day Gnosticism. It appeals to this esoteric, deeper, hidden meaning that is only able to be found by computers. And it's just, I have even less taste for it than you. I will be even more blunt than you. It's garbage. It's nonsense. Don't pay one whit of attention to it. That's my own thing. That's not Christopher Dost's words. Those are mine. Yep. Let's jump to somebody wanted to know, do you take a position on any particular Pentateuch Hebrew Bible source hypothesis? Are you a JEDP guy? Are you a JE guy? Are you the Toledot are the sources and they were stitched together? Are you someone?
Yeah.
Where do you end on that?
Here's the bottom line, is that there's not a single person who knows. Nobody knows. And there are problems with every view that has ever been posited from Mosaic authorship. And there are major problems with Mosaic authorship that, the idea that Moses wrote
about his own death.
Well, and even more simply than that, the Torah never says that Moses wrote the Torah. It's just that simple. So it's not like, I have a book here by, sorry, it's a green screen. So that green book did not show up well, but let's
That
take
was
this
a great cover.
There we go. Yeah, don't use green books when you got a green screen. Okay. So the Bible with and without Jesus. Okay. Amy Jill Levine and Mark Brettler. We know who wrote it. Okay. The letter to the Romans. It says Paul wrote it. There is no such statement there in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, whatever you want to call it. What do we do about Jesus's statements when he refers to Moses? Well, you have to keep in mind that it is at the very least within the realm of possibility. And a lot of this ties into one's own Christology too. So, but it's at least within the realm of possibility that Jesus works with operating assumptions, that this is how people think about it. And if that's the case, then do we really take anything that Jesus says, with regard to that alludes to Mosaic authorship as necessarily being an affirmation that Moses actually wrote it? So I'm not saying I'm right. All I'm saying is that there's room for discussion here. And so it's something that we don't need to really dig our heels in on. The JEDP piece, essentially that the Torah as we have it, the Hebrew Torah, is derived from 4 independent literary sources, J, E, D, and P, which were, essentially 10th, 9th, 7th, and 6th centuries, and, kind of woven together at the end there, had problems from its inception. Even Gunkel, his form critical work undermined JEDP. This is something that Alexander Roffey, I think, talks about in his book. So even from the time of Wellhausen, there have been problems with the 4-source hypothesis. So I think what is far more likely is that we have something kind of like what I said at the beginning, that many of these traditions developed orally, grew into literary pieces over time. But the other piece is that the Pentateuch contains reinterpretations of certain laws. So why is it that we have 3 different forms of the law on slaves and what to do with them? It really doesn't make sense. And so what makes sense to me is that over time, the Pentateuch was updated for new social circumstances, because otherwise I have a hard time making sense of what appear to be contradictions within the Pentateuch. If someone follows that line of thinking, then obviously it's going to change their view on biblical authorship, at least the authorship of the Pentateuch, and it creates some fundamental questions about those broader questions of what the Bible is, what the Bible is not, that kind of thing. So at the end of the day, it's a super complex issue. Nobody has resolved it. I think what's important is that we at least accept that there are tensions there that need to be addressed, and sweeping them under the rug does not do anyone any favors. So to take a step back and, since we're dealing principally with a Christian audience here, the bigger question is this even important? And the answer is yes and no. In terms of understanding what the Bible is, the history of the interpretation of the Bible, if we believe in interpreting the Bible against its context, that means we have to take issues of dating and authorship seriously, right? But on the other hand, Christian theology, I think, traditionally has wrongly been thought of as having a number of 9 or 10 central doctrines: bibliology, theology proper, hamartiology, the doctrine of sin, and Christology, pneumatology. So, and what I come back to is that when I look at 1 Corinthians 15:3, and Paul says, I delivered unto you as of first importance. So he says, this, what I have to tell you here is of first importance. And he goes on to say that Jesus bodily died, was buried, and he rose again from the dead. That's of first importance. So while some of these text critical issues and these issues pertaining to the history of the transmission of the Bible are interesting, they're complex, yes, quite unsettling, because so often we have, in the same way that TikTok disseminates misinformation, Unfortunately, pastors have also been guilty of disseminating misinformation, not intentionally, but nobody has a monopoly on knowledge, so we have to expect that. So I think for those who are coming from a Christian perspective, we have to keep the main thing the main thing. And for me, that has to do with the resurrection of Jesus. Some of these other matters, yes, super important, super interesting, valuable for a whole host of reasons that we can't cover, but not the main thing. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if that helps, but that is how I see it anyway.
That's great. That's what we want people to know is to get perspectives and to hear how scholars address these things and approach these things. And I think there are issues that need to be discussed and teased out. And there needs to be even some of my favorite scholars, we don't agree on some things, on some issues of like authorship or dating of a certain text or this and that. And yet I still go to their work regularly and recommend their work wholeheartedly and learn from them, because everyone has something valuable to contribute when everyone's seeking the same thing and listening to each other and being willing to have these discussions, being willing to argue. And so I do think for some viewers who may be tempted to say, well, just it's all that matters is Jesus. No, I think what Chris is saying, at least what I'm hearing, is that that's of first importance. And that the further you get away from that, the more leeway and charity needs to be given to disagreement.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that something's not the main thing, so it's not important at all. I
Lots of
personally
important things.
Yeah. I think that, like Pentateuch authorship, it doesn't have to, but it can have residual effects for how people view the history of religion, the reliability of the concept of God, even the Jewish people. Sure. A lot of Old Testament scholarship of the 1800s and 1900s was rooted in not even hidden, but open anti-Semitism. And studying the Hebrew religion as this primitive thing that got us to begrudgingly the real thing, which was the New Testament. Well, that's blatant Marcionism. And some people, though, who have elevated in scholarship were just rank anti-Semites, and their works contributed to continued dismissing of the Jewish people and this and that. So it's not like if you have a scholarly view, you're going to go that way. But it shows how scholarship is not, you can't hermetically seal it from ethics or politics or history or, all these fields are interconnected. So tread with caution, everyone, and give charity and then have the discussions. That's, of course.
Hey, you told me straight up that you questioned some of the views that I state in my book, and yet here we are having a conversation, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the people that I appreciate, stuff that I've put out in videos or stuff that I've written, I have good friends who are like, I think you're wrong. I'm like, well, I think I'm right. I think you're wrong, but but we still love each other. They are still people I look to. I would be aware if I came across somebody who I agreed with everything they said and they agreed with everything I'd said. I'd be like, okay, wait a minute. I think something's off here. This is a plot. Genesis 1:1. Some people translate it, in the beginning God created, and it's talking about creation ex nihilo. Some people translate it, in the beginning when God be created, and it's talking about, something shortly after the beginning. And then some people translate it, in the beginning of when God created, or the beginning of God's creation. Where do you land on it?
Yeah, so I think, and this is one area where I am all but certain that I'm right on this.
Oh, all right.
I'll go with all but certain. So the word Bereshit, the first word, which is traditionally translated in the beginning, it can be translated in the beginning. Many have made the point that the word Bereshit lacks the definite article. And that is true in form. The vocalization, the vowel that we would expect there, it should be Bareshit instead of Bereshit. Okay, subtle difference. Yes, that is what we should expect. Okay, but there are cases in the Hebrew Bible where a definite article is omitted in spelling, but it is to be understood, clearly to be understood in meaning. Anybody who's worked with, I don't know, for example, if you have competency in Spanish and English, for instance, there is not a one-to-one correspondence with how you use the definite article. Depending on where it falls in a sentence, when I'm talking with my Spanish students, they would either refer to me as Señor Chris or El Señor Chris. And in Spanish, it can be either, but we would never say the Mr. Chris in English. That just doesn't make sense. Anyways, maybe not the best example, but hopefully it gives, some idea. So in and of itself, Bereshit can mean in the beginning, or it could mean, in the beginning of, or when God created, that kind of thing. One of these alternative views that you see like in the New Revised Standard Version or something like that. Looking grammatically at the form Bereshit does not resolve the issue. What I think does resolve the issue is the beginning of verse 2. And it's the fact that verse 2, and we'll pull it up here, if that's all right. If verse 1 were supposed to end in a period, as it's were, that it was a complete thought, we would expect the verb to come first in verse 2 and the subject to come second. The fact that it's the other way around and that the word that says, and first. The land, v'ha'aretz, exactly, suggests that this is a subordinate clause in Hebrew. And therefore, if that's a subordinate clause, it means that verse 1 cannot end in a period. And if verse 1 can't end in a period, then that means Bereshit cannot be translated as in the beginning. And so what it amounts to is that Genesis 1:1 should be read, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, comma, the earth was messy schmessy, as one rabbi put it.
That's great. I've never heard that of tohu bohu, but I love that, messy schmessy.
So, yeah, I can't take credit for that one, but some other time we'll talk about that. So when God began to create the heavens and the earth, comma, the earth was, a barren wasteland. It was just a mess. And darkness was over the face of the deep. Okay. And the wind of God, the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water. Verse 3, then God said, let there be light. And it's because of the way verse 2 begins and the way verse 3 begins that suggests that verse 3 is the main clause of essentially one long sentence that extends from the beginning of verse 1 to the middle of verse 3. So the first period that we should see there is after, and God said, let there be light, period. And there was light, period. But to end verse 1 with a period, while it may be the traditional reading, does not make, to my mind, any sense in light of a couple of grammatical and syntactical issues in the verse. The question people have is, well, what about, creation? Does this undermine? That's a bigger issue where I'd refer people, back to the work of John Walton. Ancient creation stories are not interested in the creation of material stuff. They're interested essentially in ideology, theology, that sort of thing. In Genesis 1, it never was meant to be a science book about how the earth was created, how the universe was created. What it was designed to say, and we just don't have time to get into all the details of why, is it was written to say that at the beginning of time, God kept Sabbath. Therefore, you, O Jew, Judean, depending on how correct we want to be historically, you should keep Sabbath too. I think the biggest problem there is not so much the Hebrew, it's the tradition that has developed around this verse. And people have they believe that it's a liberal agenda that drives the retranslation of this. It's not. It's just, in this case, the traditional reading simply is not the best reading according to the rules of Hebrew grammar in the Hebrew Bible. So that's where I land on that. Obviously, I'm very opinionated. So,
but you're not uneducatedly opinionated. That's the difference. It's not something that, and it's not even something that's outside of your wheelhouse that you are relatively well read on, and you have a strong, like this is your focus, and you focus specifically on the linguistic argument, and you're making a compelling linguistic case. How one incorporates that with, well, what did the Septuagint translators do with it, and how did they render it, and what degree weight should be given there, and this and that.
Right.
At that point, you're having a good scholarship, biblical theological argument.
Right.
You're not basing it on emotion. You're not basing it on some ideological thing you're trying to put forward. And this is why, when I talk with viewers, or when I'm teaching courses at churches or speaking in places, when people ask questions like, what about, I mentioned again, what about Jonah? Or you've mentioned Job. Those are two books that there's people quickly ask, they want to know, but is it history? Did it really happen? What I've found, what they're really asking is, do you believe in miracles? Do you believe that God is real? Because when I sit down and say, well, let's actually talk about the issues with Jonah, whether it's possible that it is a crafted story, tale, parable, whatever you want to call it, piece of satire, humor even, or whether it's history, you're really wanting to know, do I think miracles could happen? Because your whole faith is based on the resurrection of Jesus, which is a miracle. Right. So if I say Jonah probably wasn't historical, you're going to lead a direct line to questioning the resurrection. And you want to cut that off at the bud and say, no, that's not the discussion that we're having. And that's not what I hear you saying, or any other scholar who's put forth a non-traditional translation of Genesis 1:1 is not because you're trying to make a metaphysical statement. No. It's the text.
I happen to believe that there is a God who created the universe, and all that I'm saying is, from a historian's perspective, from a linguist's perspective, that's not the point that Genesis 1 is making.
Right.
And so, but just because let's assume for the sake of argument that I'm right. If I am right, it doesn't mean that God didn't create the universe. So I think it's important to make those distinctions and not commit the error of making jumps in logic, illogical leaps. Yeah.
Final question a viewer wanted to know, how do you land on, was Israel one kingdom that divided and split north-south, and, or was Israel, as some people have reconstructed through archaeology or what they've considered archaeology, findings and anthropology and comparative religions, Israel was this conglomeration of different tribalistic views that came together and eventually produced the people Israel, who then retroactively wrote their history as the Exodus and this and that. So kind of where do you land, or how do you approach those questions?
Yeah, I mean, that issue is really part of a much bigger discussion, and that is the question of what is historiography. I use the term, many people use the term history to talk about what actually happened. Mm-hmm. Historiography is what people wrote about the past, whether it's true or not. And so you alluded to that. I mean, even with Jonah, the book of Esther, did that actually happen in real space and real time? Well, that's up for debate. I would say theologically, it doesn't matter, because it's the point of the story, in the same way that Jesus tells parables, and he can just begin. He doesn't say, hey, everybody, I'm telling a parable all the time. He might start with a story, and you're just expected to know, this is a parable. And so is it possible to read Esther like that? I think so. And I think there are other cases in the Hebrew Bible where something is not identified as, allegorical or, a parable. When biblical writers write about the past, are they always committed to telling the truth as it actually happened? And the answer to that question has to be no. If for no other reason than when you look at the synoptic gospels, the events in Jesus's ministry are presented out of order. So we learn from that, quite simply, ancient historiographers had a freedom in how they told stories. Events could be rearranged. Was there license? Yes, absolutely there was license. And, I have a chapter in Jesus's Bible on historiography for this reason, because how we think about the assumptions we have about texts that are historiographic, should our operating assumption be that these are written in order to accurately reflect the facts 100% of the time? My answer to that question is no. In the same way that if you were to ask Jesus, did that actually happen? This sower that went out to sow, is that story 100% historically true? I don't know that he'd dignify the question with the response, because it's assumed that it's just a parable. We're focusing on the lesson here. It doesn't matter if it's true. Mm-hmm. And now that's also, again, for Christians, this is problematic because the Christian faith, as I mentioned before, rests on the fact that Jesus bodily, historically rose from the grave. So does our view on historiography matter? Yeah, absolutely, it matters. But, what we think about the book of Jonah, whether that, is it's a symbolic commentary on the Israelite institution of prophecy, rather than about just a historical retelling of, what happened, in the life of the prophet Jonah.
Let me press a little bit, though, because, Jonah, Esther, those books in the prophets and the writings are one thing. But what about the books that are intended solely to give Israel's history? Books like Samuel or Kings or even Chronicles. And then the event of all events in Israel's history, the Exodus. That is what God seems to base his whole reassurance every time Israel has questions. And every time the psalmists wrestle with questions, it's, I am the God of Israel, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, so there seems to be, I come from mainline traditions where they want to say everything's parable. If I don't like it or understand it or want to acknowledge it as history, parable. I think that's when you get into, well, now everything's a parable, so nothing means anything. Right. And that's not what you're saying. I'm not saying you're saying that.
It's case by case basis.
So it would depend on the book or the subject or the time in history.
It's so many different factors. And, one teacher that I had used to say 3 trees make a row. And what he meant by that, he would use it in this way, is that when you want to evaluate whether one view is the most likely explanation for something, if you have one piece of evidence to support it, not terribly convincing. 2 pieces of evidence, it could be a coincidence. Once you have 3 independent pieces of evidence that point in the same direction, then you are on solid historical footing. Doesn't mean you're right. It just means that if you're going to argue for something else, you better be able to marshal at least as much evidence, because we've at least got a compelling argument here. I think with each passage or each issue that we talk about, we have to forget about all of the other issues and just deal with this one box. Okay, we're talking about this one issue here. And, kind of like we did with Genesis, let's look at the linguistic data. Is there, grammatical, syntactical evidence in the text? Are there clues in the text? Is there internal evidence that could suggest something in the context that could suggest that the surface meaning, what we perceive to be the surface meaning, is not the intended meaning? And really, there can just be a whole host of other factors. Do external sources, historical sources from Assyria and Babylon and, so on and so forth, do they support what's there in the Bible, as they often do? Or do they present a different version? And if so, how do we determine which one is right and which one is wrong? And so when we deal with these types of complex issues, we can't allow our drive-through culture to dictate how we deal with answering these types of questions. Mm-hmm. And kind of like you were alluding to before, people want theological answers from TikTok. It's like, that's not how it works. If we are really interested in the pursuit of truth, whether it be historical truth, whether it be metaphysical truth, we have to be willing to put in the time. And I think that's the bigger issue there. So a lot of what I say, I have no problem with people disagreeing with me, and I do not claim to have a monopoly on knowledge. What I hope to represent to other people is that it's worth the time to invest in answering these questions, regardless of the outcome. At 45 years old, as someone who's, been a practicing, believing Christian for 26 years or so, and someone who's been through the theological gauntlet, as it were, I'm still very much a believer, as much as I was beforehand. So asking these tough questions does not mean, pulling the rug out from under one's faith, but you have to be willing to put the time in to come up with meaningful answers. And unfortunately, that does not come easy. I view scholarship as an act of worship. Because if we really do believe that the Bible is a source of truth, even though we might disagree on the historicity piece, that kind of thing, how do we get to the truth? Then it deserves our sacrifice, that we should be willing to put time in, to really discern what is being said and what's not being said. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's just kind of where my mind goes with these things.
The approach resonates with me a lot, right. And I would agree with that approach. Is there are some questions, some questions you can answer easily, some questions you can't answer easily, and knowing the difference right. between them and being able to taper expectations. I think if people read your book, they're going to get a pretty good handle on where you're coming from. They won't know all your views on everything because it's a short book, and but I think they'll get a good handle on kind of your general approach and what I think is a helpful approach, especially in terms of text criticism. And that's what they'll understand, what all goes into getting the Bible that they read. And for those of you watching that have thought, okay, this discussion is still kind of above my head. Part of that's the nature of this is in a book, Chris is able to literally show a picture, an illustration, give an example, spend pages unpacking stuff, and it makes a lot more sense than in a discussion where we're covering a lot of ground and just by the nature of it. So I definitely encourage folks, check his book out, I got it on Kindle, get it in print. What's the best way for viewers to follow along with Dr. Christopher Dost?
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel, Biblical Languages and Literature. So I'm highly inconsistent in posting, but my last post was a look at the Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic of Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 1, and I think tomorrow I'll be doing verse 2. And but other times I'll do some interviews with scholars, and but it's you can check out my videos there, respond to me there. But these days, my biggest focus is, I became the CEO of Sabra Global Education. And so
I want to tell the viewers about what Sabra is and give them a pitch and let them know.
So we're a startup. We launched this in June, and we are, the long-term vision is to be an online educational institution, essentially, not accredited. We're not interested in accreditation, but really bringing in the best teachers from all fields, whether it's, K through 12 education, adult classes, whether it be in languages or religion or art. I have a friend who is a 2-time Emmy Award-winning Disney animator who teaches animation for children. What I'm trying to do with Sabra is to create an online educational platform which is free of socio-political issues. And, I'm a father of 4 kids. I've got 2 in college and 2 in high school. And, I don't want to get political. I don't like to discuss politics publicly. But I think suffice it to say that there is a growing dissatisfaction in the United States with socio-political issues and private interests infiltrating our educational system. And so, I am working to build this platform in which parents, if they want a teacher for their 5-year-old to teach them Spanish, they know that the teacher's going to teach them Spanish and only Spanish. You get an art teacher, we're only focusing on that. So we want to be free of that. But with that said, we've got a lot of cool stuff going on. I'm currently working with putting together actually a Jewish Studies certificate program. And we're going to be covering things like textual criticism, introduction to Hebrew, the history of biblical interpretation, that kind of thing. And so there's some really cool stuff on there that will be taught by some very high level and well-educated Jewish scholars and Christian scholars. And the goal is to just be objective, to educate people, not to indoctrinate people, but to just better help them understand the field of biblical studies. And so I would encourage people to, contact me if they're interested at chris@sabraedu.com. And right now we're working on our website. Our website, sabraedu.com, is up, but we're making we have a lot of construction going on behind the scenes. So stay tuned, but definitely contact me. And, in my YouTube videos, you'll be seeing pitches for some upcoming classes that I'll be teaching, like Aramaic, an introduction to Aramaic, introduction to Hebrew, biblical Greek, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's so cool. What does Sabra mean?
So it's actually an Aramaic term, which an ancient Aramaic term, which used to mean master teacher. And the reason why we stumbled upon that is simply because, as so many companies find out, is that the first 150 names that you pick are not available because the domain's not available. So parts of growing business. But it seemed fitting, especially since I've spent so much time in Aramaic, and we really are about getting the best teachers we can for people. So,
well, I think it's awesome. I love the idea for it, and I want people to check it out, especially people watching, especially viewers with kids and wanting something like extracurricular at the moment right now, extracurricular for your kids. You want your kids to be enriched. You want them to learn stuff. Definitely look into Sabra and see what Chris is doing, because it's really cool. He's talked to me before about it and just the vision for it, the idea for it. And in a global world with internet access and digital technology that's letting us talk face to face, there's just a lot of possibility. So folks, check out Sabra. Get a copy of Jesus' Bible. It's a fascinating read. Chris, I want to bring you on at some point. I want to have you back, and I want to talk more about, because you mentioned Aramaic, and that's a whole discussion I think that would be fascinating to have, as well as Arabic and why any of those languages matter, and especially Aramaic, why it matters in Scripture and stuff. So. Sure. Let's we'll set up in the future, in the coming year, maybe we'll have you back in for round 2. But for round 1, this is going on very long, and I love it. I love long form formats. So thank you so much for being here, Chris. Have a wonderful holiday season, and you're welcome anytime here in the dojo.
Thanks for the opportunity. I'm honored.